Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be going through the first chapter of a book called The Abolition of Man. It's a short book, 3 chapters, and was originally delivered as lectures, and it's by C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis was he was a sort of lay theologian, author of the Chronicles of Narnia. Perhaps that's what he is best known for. His area of expertise was as a professor of English literature, especially medieval literature. But he was familiar with many of the ancients, and he was in the same circle as people like J.R. Tolkien or Owen Barfield. So a very influential Oxford circle of letters, I suppose. And we'll be covering this work, The Abolition of Man, which fundamentally I think is about different ways to put this, but it's about education, metaethics, metaphysics, but fundamentally about what C.S. Lewis thinks is a kind of threat to man's nature, where he means human nature. And it's adjacent to a lot of the themes the Stoics talk about. He explicitly mentions the Stoics in the work. And I think it's a good work on its own, but it's worth exploring because I think perhaps a different way to put this is, I think one of the best ways to get new ideas or wrestle with your existing ideas is find a source that is similar to you in some respects, but different in others. And I think C.S. Lewis is a good writer for this reason, because he was a clear thinker, clear communicator, but also because if you're attracted to Stoicism, he has a lot of respect for the Stoics as well. And, but nonetheless, he is a Christian and has some differences.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Find somebody you respect that you disagree with. That's a great way to learn.
We'll just talk about the word broadly, and then we'll just jump into it with some of the main claims and some of the upshots for us today, just thinking through the core arguments from C.S. Lewis and what those mean for us today. And this will be the first part of a longer series. So this lecture is split up into 3 parts. Broadly speaking, the topics of the 3 parts are, first, a thesis about miseducation, a way in which modern societies go awry in their starting with their education system. But C.S. Lewis's claim is broader than that. He thinks there's some currents of modern thought that lead us down the wrong path, as it were. So that's the first claim. The second chapter is all about this idea called the way, or the Tao, that Lewis argues for. He says a lot of fundamental philosophies, religions, and such posited that there's such a thing as the way, or the Tao, which is a kind of reality to nature that we can use to ground a life philosophy, is one way to put it. And he includes the Stoics in these philosophies, and of course Christians, Confucians, and so on. And then finally, the last chapter is about ways in which society is rejecting the way, going beyond education, but into realms of technology and politics. So I think it's one of the more interesting, it's an interesting theoretical place to end up, but very important perhaps. So I like it because we're going to touch on ethics, metaphysics, philosophy of education, and also thinking about the role of technology in our lives. So just 3 short lectures. I'm going to be covering a lot.
Yeah, sounds great. So today we're digging into the first one?
Absolutely. Today we're just going to talk about this first chapter. And before we jump into the meat of the chapter, the substance of the chapter, might be interesting to pause and get a sense of what you thought about this, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. So for those that haven't read it yet, um, and it's hard to describe without getting into the meat of it. But basically, as you posited, C.S. Lewis thinks there's a way that we go about talking about, um, almost talking about philosophy or talking about language or approaching intellectual work that is miseducating or um, well, harming kids. It's like denying a certain aspect of reality that's important. And so, I mean, he goes through it. Caleb, I'm sure you'll provide the outline to it and describe it. Um, he argues for a lot of things that I agree with. Um, and I particularly, um, I liked his approach because basically his approach, he takes a children's book, and in reviewing that children's book, he calls out some assumptions in the way we talk about things or some kind of undercurrents of contemporary intellectual culture, and says, well, let's just pause on that and say what these people are teaching kids. Let's pause on that and say, what does that actually mean? What is that implying? What kind of adults is that going to produce? What kind of picture of what it means to be a smart intellectual person is that positing? Um, and I disagree with it for these reasons. But I really think we should get into the core argument so we can discuss it.
We're good. So jumping into it, then we start with a book of English, a school book, which C.S. Lewis gives the nomenclature, the Green Book, without naming it explicitly. People have found this book. It does exist. He didn't just make something up. But for the sake of not calling some out directly in these lectures, he calls this book the Green Book, and the author is Gaius and Titius, two Latin names. And this book claims, in its second chapter, it has a story that C.S. Lewis called a well-known story of Coleridge, who was an English poet who is likely less well-known today, but still a very, he's certainly a member of the canon, of the English canon. So there's a story about Coleridge at a waterfall, and that there are two tourists present. One calls it sublime and the other pretty. And Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. And the authors said about this, when the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. So that's the quote that is a representative to Lewis of an essential mistake. You could call it a number of different things. Perhaps subjectivism might be an apt term. This idea that when you make a value judgment, you're not seeing anything else other than a fact, an expression of your feelings. If I say something is beautiful, according to these authors, I would be saying something to the extent of, I have beautiful feelings. Or if I said something was ugly, I would only be saying I have ugly feelings. And so that's clearly a kind of subjectivism that removes the ability not just to talk about objective value judgments, but really even to negotiate about the value judgments we have with others. Because if I'm just making a statement about my feelings, when I say something's wrong or something is right, or if I'm saying something is aesthetically good or aesthetically bad, if all I'm saying is reporting my feelings, there's not much to discuss or debate about, whether that's a fundamental matter of justice or, debating over the aesthetics of the last movie I watched. I'm just reporting my subjective emotions. So that's where C.S. Lewis opens is with this paradigm example of a kind of mistake, this subjectivism that is present in at least his time works of education.
Yeah, and so in the history of ethics, you have emotivism. There's going to be a lot of isms. There's motism, motivism. Is there V in that? Which is this idea. It's this boo hooray theory where when I'm saying this is good or that's a good person, I'm just saying, yay, this person. I like this person. And if I'm saying this is a bad person, I'm just saying boo this person. I'm just I'm emoting. I'm not actually describing a reality of the world. And then there is expressivism, which is the view, it's related to this, but it's the view that I'm expressing a subjective judgment. I say this is closer to expressivism. So when I'm saying that's sublime, when I say certain kinds of things, so I can say a waterfall and I can actually be referring to there's a waterfall. I can be making a kind of a true or false claim about the world. But when I'm saying something sublime, I'm just expressing how I feel. When I look at that, it makes me feel sublime, or it evokes in me these sublime feelings. That's the argument the people in the book are making. And yeah, that connects to subjectivism, as you were saying, because the reason my statements are those kinds of statements is because presumably there is no objective truth about sublimeness, or sublimeness doesn't exist in the waterfall. Sublimeness is a internal state that I'm expressing. And then same thing with like badness. People aren't bad. I'm just expressing that I don't like them, or I'm just emoting. I'm just sharing the emotion that I'm feeling when I think about that person. And I'm doing some quick Googling about expressivism, and seem to have come out around the early 30s or mid 1930s. So it's actually kind of developing around the same time C.S. Lewis is writing. So it's this you can almost frame it as this kind of like this new intellectual tradition that's coming up, this new way of, well, we've really solved this question of good and bad, of right and wrong, and these complex, messy ethical questions. We've solved them, and they're just expressions of subjective opinion, or they're expressions of emotion, or how you're currently feeling about something. They're not talking about real things out in the world. And the way I was taking this, Caleb, was that basically that's what C.S. Lewis is calling attention to. But then C.S. Lewis is also calling attention to the fact that this is a English textbook. It's a textbook about how to write English. And he kind of pauses and is like, this is a pretty big claim to be making in an English textbook. And this is not a philosophy of language textbook. It's about how to write. And it's taking for granted a lot about the nature of language, or the current philosophy of language and meta ethics. And it's kind of smuggling that view of the world into this lesson on language. And that's the thing that really freaks him out, is like when you're smuggling that view of the world, it influences the children that are reading it, influences the way they think about the world, because you're bringing in a philosophical viewpoint along with it. Namely, that viewpoint, as you were saying, of subjectivism, of this lack of objective moral values that you can describe rightly or wrongly with language.
And it is related to something that I saw in my English classes, which is the fact versus opinion distinction. I don't know if this is something that you ran into in your schooling, Michael, but occasionally different English textbooks would say there are two kinds of claims about the world. You can state your facts, and these are maybe ordinary scientific judgments or empirical judgments, or you can state your opinion, and this is beliefs, your beliefs about what things are bad or good in the world, and you should treat all opinions as opinions and all fact judgments as facts, and something of this sort that can easily lead to. There are different ways of sketching out that distinction, of course, and most times it's introduced. It's not, as in the case that C.S. Lewis talks about, it's not introduced in the most conceptually clear way, which is to say it's probably incoherent. But that view, I think, leads to something similar, which is first, opinions are just that. They're just reports of belief or feelings or what have you. And they're not something one can discuss in a objective way and have one party be impartially considered mistaken or impartially considered correct. That's one upshot. And the other upshot C.S. Lewis mentions here is that opinions, value judgments, they're unimportant. Because if all you're saying when you see something beautiful or ugly is reporting your feelings, that's not as important perhaps as a claim about how the world actually is or something of that nature. In addition to the claim about the nature of value judgments, there's a kind of practical upshot here is that even these discussions about value judgments are not important. It's almost a practical upshot in itself.
Yeah, to follow up on your second point, it's kind of like you've got how much money you make, which you can measure, or how many cars the factory produces. Those are facts. Those are things that you can document, that are observable, that are measurable. The sublimeness of the waterfall, the beauty of nature, those are opinions, those are judgments. And so they're not measurable, they're not objective, they're not facts, they're less important. That's another kind of philosophical position that's being smuggled in there. And to your point, I hadn't heard the fact or opinion distinction. Maybe we didn't get that in Canada, or I didn't pay attention. But I'm Googling it now, and they've got these little handouts for fifth grade classrooms. And it's like opinion. It's exactly as you said. Facts are things that exist and are provable and observable, measurable. And opinions are just a personal judgment. There's no proof. They're not certain. Look for the signal words of opinions, good/bad. And so it's like, okay, anytime I make a good or bad claim, that's an opinion. It's not founded on proof and it's not certain. It's that's a really, it's a pretty profound philosophical position that's getting smuggled into your fifth grade English class. And that's what C.S. Lewis is.
Right, exactly. There's a nice article by one of my former philosophy professors, Justin Breyer, on the fact-opinion dichotomy that's worth leafing through. I think if you Google it, you'll probably find it. It should be one of the first results. And the line Lewis has here is, after discussing the quote, it's something like, oh, here it is. Here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion.
Ouch.
So Lewis thinks this opinion is mistaken, first as a matter of English. If I say that something is sublime, it can't be a statement about my feelings, because the feelings experienced with sublimity are probably not sublime feelings, as it were, you might say. If to make a judgment about something, you usually feel humbled. And you can think about this with other kinds of judgments. It's certainly coherent to say something like that is beautiful without sharing beautiful feelings. Or I can say that is ugly without having ugly feelings. But that argument's a little bit quick, and perhaps a subjectivist could tidy up the formulation a little bit to avoid it. I think what Lewis is going to need, of course, and he knows this, of course, he's going to need stronger arguments to dispatch the subjectivist opinion. And do that, he first turned sort of to this traditional picture of education, which is about not starting with the feelings of the learners, but cultivating the feelings so that they have the right ones. And I think that this is a really very useful framing for philosophy as a practice, philosophy as a way of life. So he says, St. Augustine defines virtue as ordo amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. So it's a definition of virtue, which is effectively saying, the virtuous person has the ideal feelings or emotions given their circumstance. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. In other words, to teach them to have better likings and dislikings, better value judgments, the value judgments they ought to have and the feelings they ought to have. And this is very similar to the Stoics. Epictetus has a line about, in the very beginning of the handbook, ensuring that you desire the right things, that you're averse to the wrong things. I think that's a very useful way to frame the project of education, broadly speaking.
Yeah, so the way of putting it is, well, one way of putting it is that the project of philosophy or of education, it's not this intellectual project. It takes emotions and feelings very seriously. We see this in Christian philosophers. We see this in ancient philosophers. Yeah, you reference Epictetus with desire and aversion, but I also just think for Stoicism cares deeply about getting your emotions right. They just happen to think that, if you achieve knowledge, you'll have the right emotions. You hit on Aristotle because C.S. Lewis mentions Aristotle, but Aristotle's view is that emotions are really, really critical. You basically want to train kids to feel good when they do good kind of things, or feel good about, sharing or studying, or, being considerate of others, cleaning, working hard. You want to inculcate in them these positive associations with these virtuous characteristics before they can fully intellectually understand the value of them. Because then once they have that emotional foundation, you can then teach them why that is the best way to be when they are older, and they can have the intellectual understanding kind of go on top of that or secure that in place. But then Aristotle, which C.S. Lewis references, is also clear that if you kind of damage a child emotionally, if you, either through abuse or neglect or miseducation, if you make them not emotionally well adapted, then no amount of intellectual instruction will correct their character. So yeah, Aristotle has this real view of first you get the emotions right, then you solidify or clarify those correct impulses through intellectual education. And I mean, the point that I take from C.S. Lewis, which I agree, is just that education is not an emotional endeavor. It's not an intellectual endeavor, solely intellectual endeavor. It's also about the cultivation of correct emotions. Those are to say to your previous point, Caleb, they're a very important part of it. Feeling sublime around a sublime thing is a very important part of your education. Your education is not, you've missed something in your education if you say the waterfall is sublime and the other kids jump in and say, well, that's just an expressivist opinion. You're just referring to your own internal subjective state. That's an opinion, not a fact. Like, I think C.S. Lewis would be terrified of having school kids do that. Those are not smarter school kids. They've missed the kind of the emotional part of education, which is that you should see the sublime thing, the beautiful piece of nature, and feel its beauty.
And Lewis says, I think he says, he's trying to argue first, there's this philosophical mistake, and that leads to this practical mistake of not cultivating the right attitudes of, say, the modern world being an intellectual achievement. It requires expertise, competence, of course, and also being an achievement in the sense of, he's going to talk later about satisfying people's appetites. We're more comfortable, able to get food, different luxuries, entertainments, and such. But there's this other part of the soul that Plato talked about. Aristotle, of course, the spirited part that is underdeveloped, this capacity to motivate oneself, that is, of course, a deeply emotional matter, that this idea that, our value judgments are merely subjective erodes. So it is a controversial philosophical stance to say they are objective values. So how's Lewis going to defend that? We'll get a little bit more to that in the second chapter, but he tells us his view here. And then the other aspect is more about this. So, okay, once we can even ground judgments, what's C.S. Lewis's view for how this view of subjectivism is eroding our motivation or eroding sense of meaning? Can he sketch that out some more? So we'll talk about both of those. First is this idea of the way, and Lewis is emphatic that there is a doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false, and to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. The Stoics certainly agree with that. And he calls this the way or the Tao. So I'll read a longer section of this just to get a sense, just so y'all can get a sense. The Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing called the Tao. It is the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is nature, it is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly into space and time. It is also the way in which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. In ritual, says the Analects, it is harmony with nature that is prized. The ancient Jews likewise praise the law as being true, this conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to for brevity simply as the Tao or the Tao. And what is common to all of those is the idea that we can make value judgments grounded in reality, and that there's a wide overlap of what those value judgments are.
Yeah, it's like a humanist claim. It would be tempting for C.S. Lewis here to say, "Well, this is hogwash because Christianity says that there are sublime things, and to be sublime or beautiful has something to do with a recognition of God or something along these lines." But he doesn't do that. He just pulls it back a step and say all of these worldviews, all of these philosophies are positing that there's an objective reality about the world, and the purpose of philosophy or religion is to try to discover that reality, try to understand that reality, a reality that is laden with value judgments, with things that are good and beautiful, and things that are, bad and harmful. And yeah, so I'm just calling attention to the fact that by, talking about the way, he's also grounding that in Eastern traditions as well, instead of just making it just a pure kind of Christian argument, which I think exactly. Is more.
He's not a partisan of Christianity in this piece. He's talking about something more broadly. And so that's his grounding of value judgments. We'll talk about that some more in the second bit. Here, and this is the part that I think is nicely subtle in this chapter, he calls out how this bit about education, dividing things up into facts, opinions, merely talking about our feelings and such, erodes our motivation to be good. And this aligns nicely with the Platonic model of the soul, which the Stoics don't agree with straightforwardly, but I think for our purposes here, they effectively would agree with Lewis and perhaps the Platonists. They just would bundle everything into one, as it were. They would say the three are truly one. But of course, they think our emotions are important. Our soul must be spirited in the right way and such. So he says, we are told long ago by Plato, as a king governs it by his executive, so reason and man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. The head rules the belly through the chest. The seat, as Alanus tells us, of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment, these three parts, these are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man. For by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal. And a nice practical example of this, he says, the value of sentimentalism. In battle, it is not syllogisms that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their posts in the third hour of the bombardment. The crudest sentimentalism, the kind many educators would wince at, about a flag or a country or a regiment, will be of more use. And there's perhaps a lesson there for Stoics, or perhaps a kind of Stoic who might be who might be more of the cerebral nature. That even those things that might seem crude, as C.S. Lewis puts it, can motivate one in a good way. You could think of maybe the pep talk during halftime that might be somewhat, for people perhaps who are not wrapped up in the game, might be a somewhat silly affair. But if you're in the right emotional space to hear that pep talk, to get in sync with the rest of your teammates, you can help change the tide of the game or something of that nature.
Yeah, totally. People that do incredible things are motivated by emotion. It's what allows them spirit, this drive, whatever you want to call it. It's what allows them to do these very challenging things. It allows them to motivate sustained action over time. We don't want to get distracted too much by the Plato versus Stoic conception of the soul. I don't know if it's really relevant here for the argument, but the point is that a solely intellectual life is not a better one. And the evidence of this is because you might criticize people that are, sentimental. You might criticize the person who watches the motivational speech or something, or, has a little cheesy phrase around the sports game as the example that gets the team fired up. You could imagine the stuck-up intellectual person in the stands kind of judging these kinds of these phrases or these motivational tools, but they're effective. They matter. They get us doing things. They get us acting in the right kinds of ways. And then Plato's view is like, look, as long as you're getting pumped up to do the right kind of thing, as long as you're getting motivated to do a thing that makes sense to do, that you should be doing, fighting in a just war, or, defending your family, or pursuing some sort of, trying to win the sports game after you've committed to your team, even though you're really tired. Doesn't need to be a great example. As long as you're committed to something that is worth doing, then it's like pulling as much emotion as you want. There's nothing wrong with pulling that emotion in to motivate you and pull you through. Stoics have a slightly different view to it, but the position there is going to be the same, which is that in the Stoic view, which is that as long as your emotions are coming from true beliefs or kind of justified desires or impulses, then it's fine to be very motivated and very pumped up or very committed to something. And so I'm paraphrasing, maybe you have it in front of you, Caleb. I could probably pull up the passage, but there's something like, little phrases or, small phrases aren't enough to get us through these really difficult things. You need the kind of motivation to help us do it. That C.S. Lewis argues. And yeah, I mean, I agree with the point. The point is basically we've kind of rejected this emotional sides of ourselves as being kind of sentimental or non-rational, but even the most philosophical of people throughout the Western tradition have accepted and tried to integrate this emotional part of ourselves, the sentimental part of ourselves, into living a great life and doing a great thing.
Yeah, well stated.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about one other example from Lewis that I think is essential, and sketching out his position and also motivating the position of the Green Book, these educators. And I think it can bring out something subtle that can perhaps be missed in this piece that matters a lot. So Lewis's one example he gives of a man with a chest, as it were, is when a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he was said. He was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared and for which he believed to be in accord with the value which his judgment discerned in noble death. He was giving the boy the best he had, giving his spirit to humanize him as he had given of his body to beget him. It's just very well stated. But what C.S. Lewis is doing here is referencing the Latin phrase Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's a sweet thing to die for one's country. And he's also probably very likely mindful of a poem that came out of, a British poem that came out of the First World War, entitled Dulce et decorum est, or Dulce et decorum est. I suppose you should pronounce the hard C here. The last few lines are fairly well known as far as poems go. Perhaps some of listeners might recognize this. I believe it appears in some World War I films. But the last few lines are, he describes essentially a terrible death of his comrade, the poet Wilfred Owen. And the last few lines are, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." Which is just to say that's of course undercutting the value judgment that it's a great thing to die for one's country, and critiquing the Roman father that Lewis gave as an example, as a historical example. And that I think is motivating the authors of the Green Book. They're saying, look, in a way, I think they have this silly view. It is a silly philosophical view that one shouldn't make these extreme value judgments. But what's driving that picture? It's come out of the World War I. People battling perhaps over mistaken value judgments, and I think its driver is to want to avoid conflict. And you can certainly see that in ordinary relationships. If someone says this is a great movie, someone else says it's not. Sometimes it's fun to debate those sorts of things, but other times you might just let it go and just say, that's just your opinion, this is my opinion, whatever. And that's a way to resolve conflict. And it's certainly true that on a larger scale, you can have tragedy emerge from value disagreements. And perhaps a lot of the modern world is set up to avoid those kinds of tragedies. But I think Lewis is saying this is fair enough. Well, fair enough, perhaps, but you can only avoid reality so long. If you're truly avoiding making value judgments, you're losing motivation, and you're left with a world of pure appetites and intelligence, and perhaps poorly thought out value judgments in the background.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So if you reject emotion and kind of stay in this world of descriptive fact, you reject these kind of, you don't stand behind opinions about good and bad as, if not facts, at least an attempt to describe a fact. You can have some humility, but an attempt to describe a fact about the world. If you honor beauty, what is sublime, what is unjust, you don't stand behind these things. You kind of reject this emotional or spirited part of what it means to be a person. You reject an attempt to describe the world or figure out the Tao or the way of things. And I mean, I like C.S. Lewis's point, which is it's not a it can make you feel smarter than or better than other people, but it's not a good way to live. And I take your historical point about maybe it was born out of this, terrible, terrible war. So people are attempting to maybe back down a little bit or be more comfortable with disagreement. And one way of doing that is to move away from what is spirited, but we don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I want to just quote one part from here because I think he does such a good job of describing this. So he says, I myself do not enjoy the society of small children, which means that he doesn't like little kids. Because I speak from within the Tao, I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind, which is that he's not, there's not just the subjectivist, I am the way that I am. He's saying this is like a problem. This is like a way in which I'm not as good of a person as I could be. Like I don't like small children. And that is like limiting my greatness. And I just that claim that we can have an objective position on the world, and from that position, there's ways to be better or worse. That this view that this is all opinion kind of undermines. And then he gets to the point about emotions, and he says, and because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical, but they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. And so he's not stoic here. This is not I don't want to get super into the emotion. I'm feeling the pull. I have to resist the temptation because the Stoics are going to call emotions judgments. But his previous point is very Stoic, is that, emotional states can be in harmony with reason or out of harmony with reason. Basically, you can have good or bad emotions because they correspond or don't correspond to reality. You like what should be liked, or you feel nothing for what should be liked. You feel somebody who needs help and you don't feel any pity, you don't feel any empathy. That is a emotional defect. There is a problem with you emotionally that you need to then take on the project of improving your emotional life if you're committed to self-improvement. And likewise, if you see somebody that needs help and you feel the desire to help them and you feel good in helping them, well, that's something you can pat yourself on the back for. If you're like C.S. Lewis and you see small children, and instead of filling that you with joy, they fill you with contempt or anxiety, then it's like, that's not just the way you are. You can say, well, I don't feel something that I should be feeling. I don't recognize the beauty of this situation or these kids the way that I should. And that for me is just the key takeaway, is just that it's okay to kind of say some feelings are right or wrong, and that some feelings do or do not correspond with reality or correspond with the Tao or the objective facts of the situation. I thought that was just so well put by him.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think something that's interesting here is, before we wrap up, something perhaps worth thinking about some more is the centrality of aesthetic judgment to this discussion. It opens up with the example of the waterfall and whether it can be properly described as sublime or pretty. It's fairly common in philosophy for people to say things like, I'm an objectivist about moral judgments, but a subjectivist about aesthetic judgments, which is just to say, yeah, there's a fact of the matter about what's right or wrong, but of course there are different ways of sketching this out, but our value judgments about art or aesthetics, those are different. Those are places where maybe it is just opinion. But perhaps I think there's a way in which that would also be against the Tao, as it were, where, these traditional views did think, or, our opinions about beauty could be grounded in fact or fiction. I think that's something worth thinking about as at least someone who's been drawn to that view that moral reality might be objective, whereas, say, aesthetic reality is not. And sometimes people say, as an argument against moral reality being objective, they say, obviously aesthetic reality isn't objective, and moral reality is so much like aesthetic reality, so it also has to be a matter of opinion or merely subjective or what have you. And perhaps that's a place where more people should bite the bullet, as it were, and say, yeah, they are similar and they're both objective. I think the ancient Stoics would make a move close to that. Of course, we need a little bit more time to sketch that out, but I think there are views about what is beautiful or not, and they can be made with more or less accuracy, or those judgments could be made with more or less accuracy depending on the thing under in question. You know, Marcus Aurelius's judgment about how things fit into the greater whole, or did not, perhaps might help ground aesthetic judgments as well. At any rate, got a little bit lost toward the end, but I think that's something that I was thinking about while reading this.
Well, that makes good sense to me. I mean, I think the Stoics would definitely think there's beauty. Beauty is in kind of a recognition of the symmetry or order of the universe, the kind of like divineness of the universe. The question to me gets a bit vague because I'm not sure what we mean by beauty. Like, if beauty is something that makes me feel pleasure or makes me feel good, I mean, we're back in that subjectivist picture, but obviously I can say correctly that's beautiful, but I guess I'm just meaning that makes me feel good. So we need to get really clear on what beauty means. But when you were describing that, Caleb, it seemed to me a lot more clear that these judgments can be objective if I flip it. Like, when I try to say that waterfall is beautiful, like, what do I mean? What do I think? But if I say things are ugly, you know, I look at like a happy family and I say that is an ugly, disgusting thing. It's like, it seems to me really clear that I'm saying something wrong. You know, I see, you know, a beautiful, you know, national park or something, and I think this is gross. It seems to me really clear I'm saying something wrong. And so, yeah, I'm more comfortable saying aesthetic judgments must be objective because it seems to me really negative ones can be clearly false. That's my quick
perhaps
thought on
that's
it.
tied to a sort of modern undercurrent of an avoidance of conflict. I think this is correct, even though it might seem like a little bit of a stretch, where if you say you don't want to get too tied down into debates over, you know, what's the most beautiful artwork or what have you, but at the same time, you can't just go around calling things ugly. That would be mean.
Yeah. Mean it and wrong. That's what's important.
All right.
I mean, we haven't hit on the core. So the title of this first piece, the first one is Men Without Chests. And that's a reference again to Plato, or this kind of divide about you have the head, you have the desire in the belly, and then you have the spirit in the chest. And you need to motivate the stomach, the belly, by combining the head and the chest. And what you do with this over intellectual work, with this movement of claims about goodness and beauty into the opinion, is you develop this generation of men without chests, is what C.S. Lewis calls it. And I'll quote him here. It says, the operation of the Green Book and its kind is to produce what may be called men without chests. It's an outrage that they should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. This gives them the chance to say that he who attacks them attacks intelligence. This is not so. They are not distinguished from other men by any unusual skill in finding truth, nor any virginal ardor to pursue her. Indeed, it would be strange if they were. A preserving devotion to the truth, a nice sense of intellectual honor, cannot be long maintained without the aid of sentiment, which Gaius and Titius could debunk as easily as any other. It is not excess of thought, but defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks them out. Their heads are no bigger than ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so. And I thought, what a beautiful image there, which is that they're not any smarter than anybody else. They're just uneven. They're just disproportionately intellectual because they have shrunken chests. They've neglected to cultivate or fertilize the spirited part of themselves. And so they don't love truth because they can't love truth, because to want to love and pursue it it's an emotional endeavor. And so they're not real intellectuals, and that a real intellectual is that Platonic picture. It's the person who combines all parts of yourself. They're just people, they're just men without chests. They're just people who have deprived themselves of the emotional life. Really scathing
Yeah, absolutely.
and quite compelling to me.
That's a great part to call out. And there's a nice little example he discusses earlier of Gaius Anticius sort of poking fun at a silly advertisement for a cruise. I suppose in this piece it was things like adventuring after the treasures of the Indies, bringing home themselves also a treasure of golden hours and glowing colors. So C.S. Lewis, he says this is a bad bit of writing, of course. And I think you can imagine the person who's sort of dumping cold water on someone who's enthusiastic about something and perhaps stating it in a rude way or over the top way or what have you. And that kind of move can certainly seem more intellectual, more detached. But if you fully go the subjectivist route, you're denying that, in fact, there can, of course, be things worthy of awe, veneration, or admiration, even in cruises to explore other cultures or visit beautiful places in the world. So that's a nice example, I think, of what Lewis is getting at.
Yeah, like it doesn't make you better than other people to scoff at the kind of emotional language or description of something like a cruise, to try to evoke emotion or joy or something like that in that kind of description.
Awesome. Well, any last words?
I guess my last words is it's something to chew on. One, because I think to summarize it, there's a couple points that I'm going to take away from this first chapter. One is to be more skeptical of expressivism or emotivism or subjectivism claims. It's really tempting to kind of wave away genuine disagreement, just being like, well, it's just your opinion, man. Like, well, we can just agree to disagree because we're talking about if that is a good movie. And are we just being lazy there? And the better thing is bite the bullet and say, no, this is like this piece of art, this movie is disgusting, and like you are wrong if you think it is a good movie. This piece of art is beautiful, and there is something wrong about you if you haven't cultivated capacity to see that beauty. Just the same way, that might not be the worst thing, but just the same way about like, you are not physically, there's something wrong with you physically if you can't run a marathon, or not, wrong is strong, but like you don't have a skill other people have. There is beauty here to see, and you are not seeing it. So, maybe a challenge to be more objective around those things. Then there's that piece about not seeing philosophy as a purely intellectual endeavor, or education for that matter. And I think philosophy and education are strongly intertwined, but not seeing personal development as this intellectual pursuit. Don't neglect our chests. Don't become men without chests. Understand the importance of a healthy emotional life and try to cultivate that, and see the relationship of intellectual and philosophy with the cultivation of a healthy emotional life and a spirited pursuit of things that are good and worth doing. That's another piece. And then maybe just for me, with the kind of I'm interested in what he says in the other chapters, which we'll do in further episodes. But, C.S. Lewis maybe calls attention here or criticizes the Stoic way of viewing emotions, and is more of a Aristotelian or Platonist, in the sense that he views emotions as a thing to be cultivated or conditioned separate to our intellect, and then to be trained along the same path. So, I train myself to like hard work, and then I read about and understand why hard work is a good thing to do, and that's how I become a hardworking, disciplined person. Where the Stoics don't really have that view. So, when we think about education as the development of ourselves, the improvement of ourselves, what role does cultivation of emotions have to play in that? And how does cultivation of emotions, how does that maybe look different than reading about Stoicism, talking about Stoicism, practicing Stoicism? The Stoics are going to have good answers to these, but it goes back to your point at the start, Caleb, about, find somebody you respect who takes, what other traditions have to say seriously, but then still kind of disagrees. And that's what is going on here. It's more of a Platonic, Aristotelian position, which I don't know as much about Christianity, but probably you see in Christianity from influenced by that
Yeah, absolutely.
Platonic and Aristotelian background.
I think just to add to that, some additional takeaways, we have this view of grounding our value judgments on nature, as the Stoics would say, or what C.S. Lewis calls the way, the Tao. So I think that's always something to wrestle with, because exactly how you sketch that out, and we talked about this in our Philosophies of Life episodes, does shape your philosophy of life. So there's a lot there. And then also this project of cultivating one's emotional judgments. I think that's how the Stoics would put it. I think can align nicely with Stoicism. A lot of Stoic therapy is focused on diffusing negative value judgments or diffusing passions, which is essential, important work. But we shouldn't, at the same time, we shouldn't neglect, cultivating positive emotions, and also making positive emotions about things like role models and such. And that's also a necessary part of not just the Stoic project, but many other of these philosophies of life are making these positive judgments, having positive emotions that motivate you to fulfill whatever your philosophy of life is, to align yourself with the Tao, the way, as it were.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a good point to end on. That Stoicism is not just about not getting angry in traffic or not like caring what people say about you. It's also about seeing the sublimeness of the waterfall and making that judgment and feeling what you feel because of that true judgment. And it's not just achieving the numbness of removing those negative feelings. It's a great reminder.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for listening, all. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks,
Bye.
Caleb.